All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see the sun out. I'm appreciating it. Anything to boost our spirits. I'm Alexis Abramson. I'm the Dean of the Climate School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our school for our fourth signature speaker series event of the spring 2025 semester. We're really pleased that you could join us in person as well as online. Each year, the Climate School offers a signature speaker series, and that we like to feature diverse and impactful scholars, practitioners, leaders, innovators on a range of different climate-related topics. And the Climate School Signature Speaker Series really provides an opportunity for the broader Columbia community and the general public to hear from these leaders and experts on a range of topics. They span everything from research to policy to really what are sort of those solutions related to the issue of climate change. So today we have Syracuse University professor Farhana Sultana to speak about confronting climate coloniality. Excuse me. But first I'm going to introduce Professor Sheila Foster. She's a professor of climate at the Climate School and also an affiliated faculty member at the Columbia Law School. Professor Foster will share more about Dr. Sultana's work. So great.
So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Farhana Sultana, whose work I've taught in my classes and is quite impactful. And I'm very thrilled to invite her here and to have her here. She is a professor, as it says, in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse, which is their public policy school. Correct. And she is also the research director of the Program for Advancement of Research on Conflicts and Collaboration, and affiliated with a number of departments and programs. Dr. Sultana is an internationally recognized and award-winning interdisciplinary scholar, speaker, educator, and author whose work spans fields including political ecology, water governance, climate change, post-colonial development, social and environmental justice, decolonizing knowledge, and transforming systems. Her vast body of research and public scholarship draw from her experiences of having lived and worked on 3 continents, as well as from her background in the natural sciences, social sciences, and policy experience. Prior to joining Syracuse, she taught at King's College London and worked at the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP. She's author of over 100 publications, including her most recent book, Confronting Coloniality, Decolonizing Pathways for Climate Justice, but also including books such as Water Politics, Governance, Justice, and the Right to Water, Eating, Drinking, and Surviving, another book, and a book, The Right to Water, Politics, Governance, and Social Struggles. Her work has been highlighted in Nature, New York Times, BBC, MIT Technology Review, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, DW News, and many other outlets. Dr. Sultana graduated cum laude from Princeton in Geosciences and Environmental Studies. She obtained her master's and PhD in geography from the University of Minnesota, where she was the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Fellow, and she was awarded the Glenda Laws Award from the American Association of Geographers for outstanding contributions to geographic research on social issues in 2019. And finally, in 2023, she was selected as an Elevate the Discipline Fellow of the AG. So, with great pleasure, welcome, Dr. Sultana.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for that lovely introduction. Wow, I sound really good. and thank you, Dean Abramson, for hosting all of us. And thank you to those of you who are here in person and joining online. I can't see you, but hi. I don't know which way I'm supposed to look. So today, what I'm going to be doing is basically speaking to all of you at the Columbia Climate School and elsewhere, whoever's listening in, to think about the ways that climate, colonialism, and epistemic loss and damage are linked, and then how can we confront them. So one of the things that got me really interested in all of this is to link both lived experience of climate and disasters. I'm originally from Bangladesh, so we've been dealing with this for a very, very long time. But then also in terms of working with institutions and policymaking, and also the way colonization is interlinked with this, but who also talks for and about climate. So that's the context of this, and I'll go into this. So, I don't know what Zoom is doing with the with this thing, and I don't know how to get rid of it. Is there a way to minimize this?
The
Nope.
one is coming, yeah, here she comes, yeah.
So while we have some really smart tech people, let me get rid of that little box across the top. There we go. Thank you.
So move that, maybe.
No, that's it. Maybe
corner
move it to
there.
the bottom right corner. Thank you so much. I appreciate this. Oh. So these images are probably familiar to most of us, because climate change is a risk and threat multiplier, exacerbating inequities and injustices through more intense, frequent, and unpredictable weather events. Given growing ecological crises and climate-fueled disasters with rising greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuel imperialism, the global consensus is also rising to confront the systems perpetuating and exacerbating these impacts. But as I've demonstrated in recent years through my work, including my latest book, Climate Coloniality disrupts any simplistic approaches to climate justice. As a critical framework for understanding the contemporary climate crisis moment, the term I coined, climate coloniality, refers to the entanglement of colonial legacies with contemporary climate change, emphasizing how global power structures born out of colonialism and capitalism continue to shape the uneven impacts of climate change and ecological breakdown. Climate coloniality reveals how legacies of imperial violence insidiously live on, not only in environmental degradation and climate-induced disasters experienced by variously marginalized peoples across the world, but primarily in the global south, but also communities that are increasingly vulnerabilized in the global north and everywhere. What we do know about the climate disasters that are rising is that these impacts, but then also the solutions that are advanced to address them, are entangled with other processes that are not always evident. Colonial legacies have maintained the matrix of power from colonial and imperial times in both subtle and overt ways to the contemporary moment and will into the future, thereby complicating climate politics at global and local scales. We know that in addition to adaptation and mitigation, loss and damage have now gained traction in discourses around what do we do about climate change. I feel like there should be a TV series with that name.
Yeah, I love it.
So yes, I should create it. While loss and damage are now central to climate change discussions, in addition to mitigation and adaptation, these are often focused on the physical and economic impacts on vulnerable populations. This can overlook the epistemic dimensions of loss. For instance, the erasure of knowledge, silencing of voices, and denial of participation for those from the global south and indigenous communities and communities of color. In many ways, the epistemic losses reflect an enduring colonial structure that not only shapes the uneven distribution of the climate impacts you see and you don't see, but also determines who can speak, whose knowledge counts in global climate governance and knowledge production. Epistemic silencing turns into epistemic violence and erasure of knowledge and expertise in the discourses around climate at all scales, whether local or global. The assumptions, the methods, and the imagined solutions to climate injustices are thus incomplete, resulting in even more losses and damages. That is my central contention of this publication. The climate crisis isn't just producing losses and damages materially, culturally, ecologically, and economically, but in more insidious and long-standing ways. It is causing harm in the production and circulation of knowledge, access to opportunities, having a voice and being heard and heeded, and thereby the abilities to influence policymaking and decision-making and change the trajectories of lived realities everywhere. We know that voice is power, but who has voice and whose voice is deemed worthy are entangled with climate coloniality. To emphasize a reparative approach away from these losses and damages, we need to decolonize how we understand climate justice, how we theorize it, what frameworks we use, and then what knowledge is produced about all of these issues. the ongoing systemic and structural problem is not only a matter of representation, but it also reflects the power dynamics and biases embedded in current climate policymaking processes. These biases favor certain forms of knowledge, for instance, scientific and technical, and certain groups of people, especially experts or elites, while marginalizing other, primarily local knowledge and indigenous knowledge. They also favor certain policy solutions, mostly market-based and technological, because the tech oligarchy will save us apparently. So while neglecting all other forms of more equitable climate justice, such as community-based and rights-based. These biases have real-world consequences as they shape the direction of climate policies and their impacts on people and the planet. The fossil-based energy system fueling the climate crisis are wrapped up in all of this, as are the challenges to low-carbon energy systems and alternative pathways as potential solutions. It becomes imperative to counter centuries of the dominant framings that produce the current crisis by centering and listening alternative ways of knowing and being in the world. We can thereby tackle the limitations in our own understandings, working towards a more complete picture of the different outcomes and alternative understandings of impacts, often hidden in greenwash narratives. This also enables us to prepare ourselves with more comprehensive knowledge and frameworks to tackle climate and ecological crises that are both ongoing but also forthcoming. Epistemic injustice is thus a significant, yet often overlooked form of climate injustice. So it is not just a part of the solution that could be a better solution, but it is also part of the production of the injustice itself. The exclusion of Indigenous and Global South voices, knowledge systems, and expertise away from the international climate forums, framings, and pathways is a loss not only for those directly impacted, but for all of us, for all of humanity. We lose what we cannot see or recognize at all, what we don't register. Colonial silencing continues to impoverish global responses to the climate crisis, perpetuating a climate coloniality that privileges Eurocentric, technical, and capitalist perspectives while marginalizing any other alternatives. So what I want to do today is critically examine the role of power, pedagogy, and praxis. I'll break it down along those three lines in this climate knowledge production, because we produce knowledge in schools such as this and in mine. So drawing on insights from Indigenous scholars and also other Global South scholars, who exist all around the world, I argue for the urgent need to decolonize the institutions that govern climate science and policy. By decolonizing knowledge production infrastructure, we can address the multiple layers of epistemic injustice that undergirds the climate crisis, reevaluate the systems through which knowledge is produced, and create spaces for alternative epistemologies that have long been ignored or devalued. Ultimately, what I call for is a fundamental rethinking of how knowledge about climate change is created, shared, used, taught, and disseminated in order to center the voices and expertise of those who are most affected by, but often least empowered to shape its trajectory. So let's very briefly break down what I mean by climate injustice and epistemic injustice in particular. So epistemic injustice refers to the systemic devaluing or exclusion of certain voices and knowledge systems. In the context of climate change, this manifests in the marginalization of Indigenous ecological knowledge, Global South epistemologies on human-environment relations, and various forms of what is often called local technical or environmental knowledge. These knowledge systems that are developed over centuries and intermingling with dominant scientific systems have managed to sustain local environments sustainably, but are often ignored or undervalued or given lip service to in international climate negotiations dominated by Western scientific and market-based approaches and increasingly controlled by fossil fuel industry. As a result, what we see is a reinforcing of the dominance of Eurocentric global North interests that continue to marginalize those most affected by climate change, but could help us think through these problems in different and more robust ways. Moreover, the exclusion of Indigenous voices, especially those that stress alternative solutions from climate governance and policymaking, perpetuate narrow technocratic solutions that fail to address the root causes. Solutions such as enforced fossil fuel energy dependency, carbon markets, geoengineering, and large-scale infrastructure projects are promoted often at the expense of more holistic, community-centered approaches that prioritize care, relationality, mutual aid, and local knowledge. Epistemic coloniality thus results from the systemic asymmetrical power relations embedded in knowledge production and dissemination, which tend to perpetuate the dominant Western epistemologies and marginalize and subjugate and subsume other forms of knowing. It encompasses how colonial structures and ideologies continue to shape knowledge systems, privileging certain forms of knowledge while silencing, devaluing, and erasing others. Thinking about coloniality of knowledge and how Eurocentric power matrices endure globally, it is not surprising then that knowledge, solutions, and policymaking around climate change are rooted in knowledge structures and power relations that privilege the more powerful and hegemonic who are entangled in production of the crisis itself. As a result, the ongoing exclusion and unhearing, which implicates all of us in many ways, these are not just incidental, they were made to happen. They're structurally embedded in global governance systems with long colonial histories, thereby perpetuating the epistemic violence of climate coloniality and ongoing energy hegemony of fossil fuel imperialism. However, justice-oriented decision-making and agenda-setting actors need to have a variety of knowledge from across the world. They need to know how to hear these messages and have access to them, and also often be trained how to listen. Wider availability of alternative knowledge and approaches makes possible for more comprehensive information and framings to tackle ongoing climate and ecological crises. Critical support for such efforts can enrich knowledge base and repertoires and provide accessible information without the need for moderation or reinterpretation, so that listeners can sit with the information, ruminate, analyze, and go back to learn more from other sources and in other ways. And here's the crux of it. Why do we need to do that? We need to teach ourselves how to do this better. So this brings me to what I've been arguing for many years. We need to decolonize our educational systems and expand the transdisciplinary knowledge that can help foster critical skill development to shift the needle. This can involve, among other things, improving awareness of the workings of power and power relations spatially and temporally, practicing the art of deep and reflexive listening, bearing witness to and valuing diverse and inclusive forms of knowledge systems, and understanding and practicing pluriversality. But these are not only essential for decolonizing minds and pedagogy, but they can help towards recentering those Indigenous voices and perspectives and re-envisioning a better and more convivial future for humans and more than human species. So to demonstrate my point, I weave in narratives from a project called Voices from the Global South. This is a series of short documentaries produced by the Open University in England, the Royal Geographical Society of England, and the International Geographical Union, which is the global international geographical body. It features experts and activists from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, Bangladesh, Chile, Fiji, Nepal, South Africa, and Uganda. Through case studies in each country, the contributors poignantly demonstrate the need to confront climate coloniality, decolonize climate discourses, and address climate justice and injustice, and to value Indigenous and local knowledge, as well as methodologically how we can practice deep listening to understand what it means to unlearn, to relearn, and to showcase what engagement with wider public scholarship and art could advance. While I use these case studies as exemplars of existing debates and critiques, countless other examples from across the globe can substantiate the concerns discussed here. So what these documentaries do is I was not involved in making them, but I was involved in assessing it at the end. So this is how I got to know it better. So starting with the speeches and visuals from the annual Conference of Parties on Climate Change, which was held in Scotland, COP26 in 2021. The documentaries traverse the globe to capture critiques and counter-narratives from across the global south, which is often called a post-colonial world across Latin America, Asia, and Africa, while understanding that these are very contentious terms, global north and global south, because one exists in the other, right? But we can sort of see, if we trace that kind of European colonization and the continued underdevelopment of Africa, parts of Latin America, and parts of Asia, we can trace the ways certain countries evolved and communities developed. We can also therefore trace how Western science and Eurocentric knowledge went global with European colonialism and its legacies, resulting in dominant narratives still emerging in the global north and their former colonies and contemporary imperial seats of power and sites that control certain discourses, decision-making, material outcomes, and finances by countries, corporations, and elites. While global north and global south have complex and contested meanings and are often used as heuristic devices, they are nonetheless marked by historical differences. So flipping the world map encourages us to think critically about the legacies of colonialism, stratification, and hierarchy. And such a map, often used even in the UN, you see what is known as historically the global south prominently figured. So we have to sort of flip our mind to even interpret this map, because we become so accustomed to seeing it where England is the center of the world.
Brilliant.
So here are some clips from the film. So let me tell you why I think this is important. This tells a story about power and voice in climate spaces. Considering the workings of power and voice, climate change discourses are dominated by global north countries, interests, and experts, as well as their elite allies elsewhere. But standpoint and positionality matter, as do contextual knowledge and more expansive geographical framings. So this ongoing hegemony is a hindrance for more fruitful and equitable futures, which is why the COPs are often called failures. The contributors featured in Voices from the Global South highlight what is overlooked by those from powerful advanced industrial countries and decision makers, such as inequitable impacts of climate change, unequal access to opportunities to speak and be heard, the power relations that influence climate policymaking and framings, and having to deal with ongoing impacts of colonialism and skewed development politics and outcomes, having to face various biases in media coverage and discursive framings, and the plethora of other concerns that need wider attention but are often not even known about. So the global climate conferences offer a glimpse of the wider political economy of power at different spaces and scales. And having studied some of these large conferences, this is what drew me to even being the person who did the, kind of gave a commentary and assessed the outcome of this big project. There are vast inequities built into the systems that govern what is said, debated, and decided about climate change, its interconnected impacts, and the actions that should be pursued, and the policies that are debated. But we know that access and voice matters in such spaces, as does being heard and listened to. The barriers to participation in international climate forums or other decision-making spaces are numerous and deeply entrenched. Activists and scholars from global south countries frequently face difficulties in attending COPs and other platforms due to financial resources, visa hassles, accreditation, and simultaneous webcasts or media coverage of events, as well as language barriers, but also being deplatformed at critical moments and the mic being cut off. So we know that in terms of even being present is a privilege and is a struggle, but often even being present doesn't matter if your voice is continually marginalized and you cannot access certain rooms and closed door meetings. And this stark power imbalance in venues such as the COP really showcase what we mean by the chronic gaps in knowledge and policy, thereby reproducing hegemonic or dominant narratives, which are influenced increasingly by fossil fuel corporations and powerful states. But there are other forms of silencing, such as lack of access to the mic, not being put on the schedule, being barred from the conferences and certain debates or discussions, being denied an audience or speaking to an empty room. This was addressed by Indigenous activist India Logan Riley from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and climate scientist, Dr. Salim-ul-Haq from Bangladesh, in their respective films. And those who don't know, Dr. Salim-ul-Haq passed away 2 years ago, and he was my mentor since I was a student back in the late 90s. So it was a massive loss to me. But this is why this is important in terms of the photo on the right-hand side. So Nature, the journal Nature, which is a renowned scientific journal, called Dr. Salim-ul-Haq a climate revolutionary and one of the top 10 most important people to help shape climate science in 2022. But when he spoke at COP26, world leaders could not be bothered to show up.
Wow.
The empty room you see on the right with Dr. Salim-ul-Haq projected on the screens serves as a metaphor for that epistemic void I'm talking about. This is the void, this is the unhearing that happens even to people who have PhDs from places like Imperial College in London, who are globally renowned, but they look like me. And people often don't show up, or they show up and we become cricketers. So what are we saying and then not being heard, or often heads are nodding, and it's increasingly just performative. But in this particular moment, in that empty room, I found this epistemic void in global climate governance. And this space, this emptiness, is where knowledge of the most vulnerable is rendered invisible. Chronically ignoring a range of voices means disproportionate impacts and burdens of climate injustices occur not only in long-term exposure to different hazards and vulnerabilities, but also from the devaluation of expertise of various communities who have learned to deal with them. Wouldn't it be cool if we learned from people who know, instead of reinvent the wheel? But hey, we're gonna reinvent the wheel. The inequalities in climate change policymaking and governance thus have serious implications on the ground. Global South countries not only have not having power and influence over climate change policy debates leads to a chronic underrepresentation in all contexts, from policymaking to being in the IPCC, such as which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to negotiating power in bilateral and multinational trade relations and so on, because trade is such an important component to how climate impacts play out, as is aid, right? So it's both trade and aid. So in another set of films that focus on Nepal and Bangladesh in this series of documentaries, they show how the exclusion of voices tend to recreate certain displacement and marginalization of indigenous peoples in what is called often fortress conservation. So large, green bonds and barring people from accessing their ancestral homelands in forested communities end up recreating those colonial patterns and reinforcing them, because that's exactly what happened in enclosure of the commons during colonization. Social inequity and climate vulnerability persist as a result everywhere. In the documentaries from South Africa, we see the intersection of race and class that influences how communities in the same urban area experience climate change. Because vulnerabilities are different in townships, which are a holdover from the colonial apartheid system, where marginalized people are facing severe water crises, energy poverty, and heat stress. So we go from a mountainous forest down to a coastal city of Cape Town, but we see similar patterns of coloniality and dispossession. So this brings me to the importance of Indigenous voices. Epistemic loss is also evident in how stories of impacted communities are translated and appropriated in global forums. Often, the nuanced, deeply complex histories of Indigenous and Global South communities are repackaged in depoliticized narratives that fit technocratic frameworks, or basically in lip service. For example, Indigenous peoples' resistance against extractive industries, fossil fuel mining, and climate-related displacement are often framed as environmental activism, rather than as struggles for sovereignty, self-determination, and survival. Such reframing downplays the political dimensions of these struggles, marginalizing the broader calls for justice that are central to them. Indigenous scholars have highlighted how coloniality is not only perpetuated certain framings and explanations, but also produced biased knowledge that is in turn universalized. It is critically important to understand the tensions between Western science and indigenous science as disparate ways of knowing and being in the world, but also those that can inhabit in terms of making better policy. The colonial epistemicide against indigenous science has been ongoing for centuries. Eurocentric hegemony has marginalized and othered in what it sees as incompatible knowledge systems, thus limiting our ability to even question who has the right to produce climate knowledge, because we've all been indoctrinated to believe the climatologist is the one who knows. While indigenous knowledge systems are excluded from hegemonic climate discourses and practices, they contain important existing cosmologies of decolonial knowledge and resistance that center on accountable, reciprocal, and ethical relations and processes. If we want to decolonize our knowledge about climate and our institutions, then we must create alternative forms of epistemic justice. This includes valuing and fostering other epistemological knowledges and methodologies, and promoting different knowledge holders and experts. The universality of Eurocentric models reinforced across the world has resulted in the capitalist colonialist crisis of climate breakdown. It is time to unlearn all of this so that we can learn differently, to conceptualize and practice the just futures we want by combining the systems that already exist and those that have been put out of our reach for some time. So for instance, going back to these documentaries, the case studies from Chile and Australia underlined the that very importance of combining Western and indigenous knowledge equitably and reflexively to avoid the continued extraction or theft of indigenous and local knowledge around the world. Indigenous climate justice teaches us more expansively about interconnectivity and relationality. Climate or energy justice is not only about separation of nature and society, but about people and communities being part of climate change and nature. Decolonization is thus about not only ontology and epistemology, but understanding methodology, and also how methodology is central to both epistemology and ontology. The films showcase storytelling, for instance, as methodologically the way indigenous methodology of relationality and knowledge sharing thrives. In Aboriginal Australia, countermapping and renaming are methodologies being used to challenge the colonial power of maps that impose certain normative controls across the world through cartography. And as a geographer, and cartography being one of our subdisciplines, yes, geography is very implicated as a colonial discipline. So we are working very hard to unpack and undo all of this. So in the films from Chile, indigenous analysis exposed how green transition is exacerbating ecological extraction and destruction practices in the country's lithium mines. And lithium is necessary for what? Electronic vehicles. So what we see is that these kinds of knowledge being made central disrupt a dichotomous thinking of that all green transitions are positive everywhere all at once. They're not. On the other hand, the case study from Fiji and New Zealand showcased the importance of interrogating the colonial roots of climate change, especially in the ways that indigenous knowledge is included or excluded. Colonial legacies of inequities and hierarchies of knowledge systems, alongside persistent hierarchies of power relations, ensure that differences and injustices are maintained across different sectors and scales. But by confronting coloniality and the structures that create and maintain the knowledge hierarchies of expertise and value, we can see how impacts of colonial domination repeats itself across the globe and across sectors and at different scales. For instance, Pacific Islander expert Steve Ratuva from Fiji highlighted the role of colonialism, multiple narratives, and the importance of paying attention to nuances. These elements are lost in the grand universalizing narrative of climate and ecological solutionism that often come from hegemonic elites, corporations, and many global North institutions. Inclusive learning from a wide range of voices means learning from and practicing what is known as deep listening and relearning. This means appreciating indigenous and local knowledge to decolonize dominant narratives and framings of climate change. Indigenous collaborations are thus essential. as pointed out by several contributors in the documentaries, such as Tracy Bunda from Aboriginal Australia. Thus, paying attention to Indigenous cosmologies helps to challenge the universality of Cartesian science and Eurocentric knowledge production. And it helps us foster pluriversal ways of knowing and doing in addressing the climate crisis. Learning from Indigenous knowledge helps us address the climate crisis by changing, enriching, complementing, and challenging what we know and the science that we call normal and natural and the only way to do science. It helps us to understand that we need to reevaluate our systems of knowledge, production, dissemination, pedagogy. There are important components to challenge extractive knowledge practices and understand how issues are often framed to conceal that extraction, exploitation, and injustice. We can combine Indigenous science and Western science, but this necessitates working relationally and reflexively with Indigenous and Global South scholars, scientists, leaders, activists, and communities. This is what decolonization demands, and this is why it's hard work, but it's necessary. So this brings me to the third and last point that I want to make about power and praxis in decarbonizing and co-creating alternatives. So power operates both materially and discursively in legitimizing and delegitimizing what knowledge and whose knowledge counts. Certain voices, concerns, issues, and framings are rendered invisible, illegible, and devalued in different ways. To shake up conversations around climate change and to challenge ongoing destructive and extractive trends and realities, uncomfortable conversations need to be had, heard, and shared, like we're doing right now. Climate justice must be about historically underrepresented peoples, alternative framings of discourses, and inclusion of voices that accounts for differential power relations. It is about much more than greenhouse gas emissions. If we are to seriously decolonize climate, we must be able to name the problem first, recognize our complicity, recognize we don't know everything, and then identify more inclusive ways that injustices can be tackled and who can help work with us to tackle them in a better way. Collaboration is essential, but so is speaking up when necessary, and at times, silencing ourselves, decentering ourselves so that we may create space for others and listen to voices that have historically been ignored, sidelined, marginalized, or else included in tokenistic ways and paid lip service to. This helps start the process to redress the losses and damages from epistemic injustice. It does not end there. This is just the beginning. So in many ways, for such actions to be fruitful, it requires that those with privilege to silence themselves create spaces and opportunities for other voices to be heard and centered in a practice of relational privilege. And all of us can practice our relational privilege in different contexts. It is about questioning our conventional wisdom, unquestioned science, and notions of equity. It is not about discarding everything we know, but about opening our minds and making space for different or more inclusive knowledge to expand our thinking and ally with others in their journey. This can mean quieting dominant narratives and those who have continued to benefit from privileged voice and material access to power and decision-making. Creating space through concerted, intentional action can result in disrupting the status quo, whether through protesting and demanding government action for climate commitments, or calling attention to the dangers of quick fix solutionism that sacrifice more at the altar of climate breakdown. So let me conclude with some parting words. So we know that the climate crisis is produced and perpetuated by colonialist and capitalist practices that extract resources, exploit labor, and marginalize non-Western knowledge systems while promoting fossil fuel economies and fallacies of endless growth on a finite planet. As countless examples have highlighted over years, it is imperative to be aware of the epistemic injustice and structures of exclusion and to hold institutions, narratives, and framings to account. The work of decolonizing climate knowledge and governance requires fundamental rethinking of how we understand and respond to the climate crisis. It is not enough to simply include more voices in climate discussions. It must also challenge the power structures that determine whose knowledge is valued and whose experiences are recognized. Epistemic injustice is a form of loss and damage that compounds the material impacts of climate change, and addressing it is essential to achieving climate justice and reparations. But it also involves redefining power relations so that epistemic justice can exist to begin with. This means we must decolonize our minds and educate ourselves away from systems that result in runaway unsustainability that values profit and destruction in the name of growth and progress, and that continues to ignore alternative knowledge and overlooks more holistic outcomes. We know that as droughts, wildfires, floods, cyclones, glacial melt, and rising sea levels continue to escalate, we have to figure out how to get out of this mess. And so I call upon all educators and learners and collaborators and doers and scientists to continue to decolonize knowledge production surrounding climate and ecological crises. Conversations and narratives about these issues are often dominated by groups and sectors with similar interests and backgrounds. And we need to figure out how we can continue to challenge those so that we can have more place-based knowledge and diverse paradigms. The trend of whitewashing climate discourses and intellectual spaces is increasingly drawing criticism, finally, and it contributing to a broader dialogue on a range of issues. So decolonizing climate discussions necessitates addressing the complexities of ongoing colonial legacies inherent in global governance structures, discursive framings, educational systems, and the construction of visions for the future. Because if you can't imagine it, you won't do it. And we need to imagine differently. To do that, we need much more critical reflexivity, more deep listening, and a commitment to stand with others and not speak for them. And this means creating those inclusive and reparative spaces to elevate voices. And learning this praxis is incredibly important as corporate coloniality across countries grow. So let me leave you with this thought. A collective reimagining for better futures is essential, and we can co-create to support more transformative planetary justice goals. We need to embody hope while being acutely aware of the challenges we face, ensuring that hope is grounded in reality and not mere platitudes. So let our hope combine with our curiosity, wonder, collaboration, celebration, abundance, and conviviality to guide us further. Because hope is born from action. So let us act collectively. Thank you very much. So this slide just has the work that I drew from to create this very short, compact speech. And that QR code basically takes you to my latest book, Confronting Coloniality, which just came out a few months ago at the very end of 2024. So I will leave you with that, and I'm happy to answer questions. Yes, Sheila.
So yes, I have to leave early, sorry about that, but I did want to, I really love the epistemic injustice, and I take it as a kind of, maybe not a critique, but I guess a pushback to the discourse of climate justice, which is kind of reflexively breaks it down into these three dimensions: distributive, procedural, and recognitional. But this idea of epistemic justice, I think, is quite destructive, I think, of that framework in a good way, right? Because it really does ask us to go a little bit deeper beyond the procedural justice, which comes from environmental. We speak for ourselves. Yes, that's right. Voices should be heard, but what you're talking about, heard in the context of a history, right? And a social and a system that has led these communities to be marginalized. So I love it. And I just wonder what you think of, if you're trying to, without actually doing it, softly critique the way that we talk about the discourse of climate justice, which I think is kind of reductive of these three dimensions.
Right. So I think the term climate justice is understood so differently, depends on which discipline and also which context,
That's right.
right? I've heard people talk about like figuring out how to work with corporate solutions as climate justice.
I've not heard that. Okay.
Yeah, I have to work with business school people. So, which is okay. Hey, you know, that means the business community is talking about it. And I think it's awesome to be in spaces where you absolutely just say, this is really bad. And then you're just gonna blow up their whole discipline. But it is reductive of the three common ways of knowing, but as we know, though, even the definition of justice is so much bigger.
Yes.
Right? Some people have said climate justice should encompass 6 different kinds of justice. 3 is not enough. Maybe it's 8. So, you know, so for me, what got me into this work is basically that kind of silencing and the erasures and what were we seeing? So there was this big report that came out early on in the pandemic about who was represented at the IPCC. So I get asked quite often in the last few years, well, would I join the IPCC? And I said, no, why? Because my university will not give me an hour off to do this work. And it is a full-time job. So therefore it's dominated by a lot of Europeans because European universities will often let you have leave to do this important global work. And but they're like, oh, but we don't have Global South voices. I'm like, right now I'm based in the global north, even though my work is where I'm from and I've worked there for a quarter of a century. But you really should get somebody from Bangladesh. So I'm kind of in this transitional, well, okay, my pen agrees that I'm in this weird transitional position, right? So when we think about how we frame climate justice, I think we need to be clear, right? So for me, it is about all of those things that you talked about, but the lack of accountability for epistemic injustice is what I'm grappling with.
Yeah.
And in the book, what I call out is the fact that often people do not at all look at the coloniality. And here I borrow the term coloniality from decolonial scholars of Latin America who talk about, you know, coloniality as an ongoing matrix of power, of coloniality of being and governance and all of that. It's a much bigger set of conversations. So I pulled from post-colonial scholarship, anti-colonial scholarships, again, transitional, right? Or hybrid, or I don't know, I could go I guess, Donna Haraway route and call it monsters or something. But I thank you for that question because it is kind of, I don't want to call it destructive, but I would call it dismantling.
Yeah.
It takes it apart. It asks it to like say, oh, let's lift the hood and see what's underneath it.
That's good.
And as a result, what we find is, how do we even talk about reparative justice when people only think about it in terms of material, right? Material, which is important. But how did we even come to create this mess? So what I'm trying to get at is to undo it, to roll it back. And that's my hope, because the time that we have to not go over those tipping balances, right? Because we have these systems that are escalating, but they work in a weird concerted way. So as a result, if we have more forms of runaway systems, that makes it harder. So how can we change the way of the knowledge that goes into even coming up with solutions, right? So, I mean, I did a critique a couple of years ago of even how the knowledge about these tipping points are created. That did not make me popular at all. So, but it was lovely to be able to say all of that in the European Parliament, though. So it's like everyone was like, "What?" So, but some of us just have to be the troublemaker. So I see it as making good trouble.
Good trouble.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Very interesting talk. I have a different type of question that's much more practical. I loved the upside down map. And I wonder if you could say more about how you use that in your teaching, or where that takes you and how students have responded to that, because I was really
Yeah.
intrigued by that idea.
So the upside down map is something that I'm familiar with because I remember when I was younger in school, it was the regular map and Europe is the center of the world, right?
Yeah.
You know, with the whole kind of crown and like all the maps you see and produce. But then when I joined the United Nations, was the first time I saw the upside down map, and I was like, whoa, this is really interesting in this like halls of power.
Yeah.
That's because I was in the what's called the soft underbelly of the UN. The UNDP is not the powerful part of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank are, right? So and it was interesting to see, and again, that has a politics behind it, you know, who pushed forward that map to be made and shared and printed out. And so, and again, those are usually primarily from Global South, you know, development experts who push for that, and they're borrowing from various anti-colonial scholars. So in the classroom, whenever I show that map, I just say, what do you see? Most students are really smart. They, you know, because all of us can read, not all of us, some of us can read upside down, or at least we recognize when it's an A. If it's upside down, we can still say that's an A, right? So it's that visual way that brain works. So like if I typed out, you know, that without the A, your brain would figure it out that those alphabets together probably mean the word that. So in a way, most people reconstruct it when they flip it back around. But if I force you to continue to engage with it, so I think what it does is it first challenges cartography, which is a great way to do it as a geographer. But it also, then I can get into the history of power of maps, and how do you lie with maps, and maps have been used to create all kinds of narratives and stories and lies. So, right, and then how does knowledge then, so in that particular map, if we scroll back to that here, so and this comes from the documentary, this is a screenshot from it. So they traced where they went, right? But if I remove those red dots, you would probably it'll take you a second to figure it out, but tracing those red dots looks different, the journey. You kind of wonder, well, why did they go that way?
Yeah.
And then you realize that's actually the shortest distance. But in your mind, you have to almost flip it back around to see, right? So what I'm trying to do by using this map, and this is what the scholars who produced this documentary, and that I'm now working with them too, is that they wanted people to feel uncomfortable. Because you learn at the edges of discomfort, right? So this also challenges the way we then think, like, well, from Scotland they went to Chile, well, yeah, that's a really long flight. But then Scotland to anywhere is a really long flight. But here's the weirdest thing, this was done during the pandemic. There was no flying, nobody went anywhere. This is all on the ground, locally recruited filming crews, and everything was done remotely. So no greenhouse gas emissions, well, limited less. But right, the first thing you think is like, oh, the team went there, then they crossed the ocean. This is just showing you where the storytelling went, where their storytelling went from here to here to here to there. But I think this in itself calls for us to understand power and hegemony, right? The hegemony of the way we construct the world, what's at the top being good, right? In that kind of weird way of visual hierarchy, but then also in terms of whose stories matter. Why is it that when you think about Nepal, you see it and you go, okay, wait, that's where Mount Everest is. Those are the Himalayan mountains. But it doesn't seem intuitive because that's at the bottom half of the map. But it's still in the subtropical zone, which is where it is on the regular map, the hegemonic map. But in terms of the concerns there are very similar to the concerns in South Africa. But South Africa is more racialized because that has a separate colonial history. So by flipping the map as a pedagogical tool, it's a great way to start these conversations about how that epistemic erasure injustice is also part of the production of, or is a resultant of the hegemony and that kind of Eurocentric knowledge production, which is how, if we are in this mess right now because of what is dominant, then that dominant can necessarily help us get out of the mess. So what is there? So what I'm trying to do is how do we elevate other forms of knowledge that could help us combine? So it's not one replacing the other, but it's a kind of a combination. What do we do? How do we decolonize our minds? And that was a process that started for me a long time back. So it came from building course syllabi. When I started out, and I was like, this doesn't make sense. I am not teaching these what I call the WD, sorry. No, hopefully, pardon my French, but basically the dead white dudes. I don't want to teach Marx and Foucault and all of this. I was like, there are plenty of really great scholars in Africa and Latin America and Asia that the students have never read, but have been translated into English and they should read. But that's how the process started. So my syllabus was already decolonized. But then I got complaints, well, you aren't teaching the famous scholars, you're teaching the son. So then those people had to be brought back in and woven together. Excuse me, and that led me to more investigation into what are the epistemic silences that even I wasn't hearing. And I had to train myself to then go look. So it's like a treasure hunt. So you teach yourself that this is a good thing. And it is a good thing, but there's a lot of resistance from a lot of people, right? They want to just continue reading what they read. They want to continue that from college to grad school because it's familiar. It's a wider set of debates available in English. So if we don't change anything, we're going to stay on the same trajectory. It's called path dependency. I mean, if you're an economist, I'm not. So the joy of being a geographer is you have to learn a little bit from every discipline. So I have to learn, I have a background in the geosciences, but some of my colleagues who don't have to learn the geomorphology and the hydrology of things, just the way I had to learn the dead white dudes. Like I didn't know who Foucault and Marx were, but I had to learn them. So this is that interdisciplinarity. But then I was like, it's interdisciplinary, but it's still Eurocentric interdisciplinary. How do we step out of that and make it transdisciplinary, but in a different way? And I think flipping the map helps with that as well. Thank you for that question. That was a great way to get deeper. I'm happy to take any other questions or curiosities or confusions.
So, you mentioned in your point before about the way that we got to the tipping points being kind of Eurocentric maybe. I would like to know, I'd like you to explain that if you wouldn't mind.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part.
The tipping points, like
Uh-huh.
I'm guessing like the 1.5 maybe. Like how we arrived at that, I would love to know.
So the way, the measurements of the tipping points is not fully what I challenged. When I joked about challenging it, what I meant is like, how is it the whole narration around tipping points as this universalizing we,
Oh, I see.
right? So it's a tipping point for whom and who created the tipping point. So how did we get here? So how is that? It's the science has been challenged by different scientists. So different climate scientists, climatologists have their own debates, right? And that measurement. So that's fine. What I was interested in is how did we get here? So like the states that are in, some of the material you heard here. So the elites, the states, the global systems, the corporations, but then at the same time, when we tip over, who does it affect, right? So just the measurement of the tipping point has its own controversy. But there's this naturalization, universalization that we all, so that whole, we're all in the same boat, we're not. Some are in little boats that are sinking, some never had a boat. Some are in the middle of the storm, some have drowned. So, that whole kind of lifeboat mentality, it's a real problematic set of debates ongoing. But even the tipping points, I think there is a way, going back to Sheila, right, who just left. In terms of like how the dominant framing is the way we have to even undo them sometimes. So talking about the tipping point has become incredibly, in my mind, just throwaway, it's like clearing your throat. I've mentioned the tipping point, I moved on. I've invoked climate justice, I've moved on, right? So, but instead of really going into detail, what does it mean to, and who it affects? How did we arrive at this tipping point? Because we're still having the damn overpopulation debate instead of the overconsumption. So so the tipping point is created because of certain forms of overconsumption and certain forms of that kind of racial capitalism that has created a form of extraction and, you know, consumption and disposal, but at the same time, this inequitable form of like eating, you know, through the earth, almost like all the resources, water, land, forest, biodiversity, rare earth minerals. And yet there's this ongoing debate about like too many children, but it's a very racialized discourse. It's too many not white children, it's too many Black and brown children. But then rather than recognizing who is contributing to that tipping point. And that's often in what I've seen is invocation of the tipping point that often then results in like, well, we're all in this together. There's that Anthropocene, but we're not recognizing that it's actually a Capitalocene or a racial Capitalocene, or, you know, there's like, or the Plantationocene. There's so many scenes right now. So that's how I was challenging that narrative, but also how it's told. It's often invoked in the storytelling of we're all in this together, but some people have had too many children. And I've had massive, massive debates with people who are very invested in telling that story rather than recognizing that maybe there's a great way to undo this kind of, I don't know, this over fascination or over dependency in relying on the growth narrative, the endless growth. This is where I find a lot of the degrowth school very appealing, because it is about having well-being, but at a smaller consumption footprint. It is about having like universal basic income, right? 4-day work weeks, having more building those reparative and relational situations, because it is about climate justice is ultimately about relationships and shifting relationships. So if we're going to think about altering trajectories, so this epistemic injustice I was talking about, there's new forms of knowledge that are arising, but it didn't come from like the Barcelona school. Everyone's like, oh, degrowth school comes from Spain. Actually, those scholars are very clear. They borrowed from scholarship in the Global South and indigenous scholarship across settler colonial contexts to come up with their theories. It just happened that these scholars are based primarily in Europe. So I get attacked all the time, like, how can you be from the Global South and support this? I was like, well, you haven't read it. It actually says, who needs to stop so that others can grow? That's why I had that seesaw image. It was in a direct, where was it? That's my way of, that's like an inside joke. The little, you know, the corporate guy with his briefcase, the really heavy dude, and then all the blue little images. Sorry, my images always have some sort of a like, yeah, I'm doing that. That has like some sort of a different story. And so this is my nod to the fact that we need to level that up. So, right? So the dude holding the briefcase, which generally represents the corporate capitalists, often global north, often the very powerful elites, and the little blue people in this, I don't know what is called, some sort of a graphic. You know, so consumption will go up in the global south, but that means we have to reduce more in the global north, because we've had, at least certain communities have had quite a longer history of exploitation and benefit. And that gets a lot of pushback, even from my colleagues in my own departments. Because they're like, well, the workers in America are struggling. I guess we're not really talking about workers in America, are we? We're talking much more about the private jet owners and the fossil fuel corporations and the people who are not paying their taxes, in terms of very wealthy people who probably live like down the road from here. So, so anyway, so that's the kind of way of like tipping point, by whom, how, what will happen afterwards. That was the debate about the tipping point at the European Parliament.
Thank you.
I think we're gonna
Oh, all right.
thank Farhana Sultana for an amazing talk. I'm Lisa Dale. I'm the director of the Climate and Society Master's Program here at the Climate School. We're really thrilled to have had this talk, very
Thank you.
provocative and lots of interesting discussion. We have one more speaker coming in our signature speaker series, and that's Catherine Mock, and she's coming on Tuesday, the 29th, which I think is a week from next Tuesday. Keep your eye on that. She's fantastic. So that's our final talk.